Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. On this podcast, if you've been here before, you know we do not shy away from challenging or sticky topics, and today is one of those. We're going to close out the year really reflecting on how we can care for yoga, and this is one of those episodes that really, I hope all yoga teachers and studios, especially those who are leading yoga teacher trainings, I really hope you have a listen. So share this with your friend who's a yoga teacher, share this with a studio, share this with someone who leads yoga teacher trainings, especially if they're not already having the conversation about cultural appropriation and how yoga has been weaponized. We are also going to talk about Palestine and how this is a yogic issue, and we're also talking about how we as yoga teachers and yoga studios can show up to support Palestine. And we get into asking some big questions about the current leader of India, who calls himself a yogi, and asking some big questions about the International Day of Yoga. So if ever you've shared a post like it's International Day of Yoga, have a listen to this episode before you do that again, and really let's dig into how yoga can be weaponized. If you're brand new here, wow, this is quite the episode for you to join us on, but I'm so thrilled that you're here. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also called the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. I'm a yoga teacher, mom of 3, entrepreneur, and a forever student who loves to ask questions. That's why podcasting feels like a good fit. I love that we get to hang out and learn more about yoga together. This podcast was made for you, the yoga teacher, because I get how it feels to be out in the real world, sort of dropped off in the jungles of entrepreneurship, trying to figure out, how do I run this business? How do I continue to learn and stay up to date with what's happening in the yoga world? And I wanted you to have a place where you can connect to other yoga teachers, ideas, and information along the way. When things are busy, you can have a listen while you're in your car, or as you're walking, or wherever it is that you cleaning. Cleaning is a great place to have a listen to a podcast so that it's like we're hanging out together, and that you have this place where you can turn and feel supported, because sometimes it's very isolating as yoga teachers and entrepreneurs. Returning listeners, thank you for hanging out here again. Thank you for spending your time here. I'm really excited to share today's episode with you. I also want to give a shout out of thank you to OfferingTree, because they support the podcast, but they also support me personally in my own business. I use and love this software because it automates everything from bookings, payments, Zoom links, reminders, and so much more. I'm going to tell you about something that OfferingTree just recently did that I was so honored to be a part of. I'll tell you about that in a moment when we get into today's episode a little bit further. But for now, I want to tell you that we have a discount code if you're like, I need a website, or I need a way that people can book or pay online. Head on over to offeringtree.com/Shannon and get our podcast listener discount. Today's episode is also brought to you by my 20-hour Yoga for Pelvic Health training. If you're thinking, how do I find out more about this, Shannon? How do I sign up and join? There are 2 variations on this. There's a 3-hour training and there's a 20-hour training, Yoga for Pelvic Health. You can find both of those over at theconnectedyogateacher.com and look under training. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So we are tackling some big questions today. I love that we're talking about how yoga teachers can and need to speak up right now, and that this is part of yoga. We're going to talk about what even is weaponization of yoga, or omwashing. How is it showing up in the military and occupational forces? Sheena shares in today's episode how she visited Palestine and how much of an impact that had on her. I love that Sheena also talks about PTSD and the huge factor that happens within military spaces, especially when people are part of dehumanization and then they are then suffering with PTSD. We talk about how Omwashing is showing up in our small yoga spaces and how we can look at that. And a couple of things that we talked about today really captured my attention. One was when yoga teachers or yoga studios are being told that we should stay out of politics or not take sides, or when yoga teachers or studios say that's what we're doing. We're staying out of all politics and we're not taking sides. We're going to have a chat about that. And my favorite is this quote that Sheena said, if someone is telling you, you're too angry, you should go and do yoga. This is a really fascinating conversation. And I feel like many of us, if you've been speaking up about any social justice issue, if you've been voicing your opinion on anything political, you might have been told something similar to that. So I'm glad that we have a space where we can chat about this today. If you have a listen to this episode today and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to go into more of this conversation, we have more ready for you. So we'll link to those in the show notes for sure. Last time I shared a podcast here with all of you, Jeevana Heyman was on talking about when the yoga teacher stumbles, and that really gets into when we feel disappointed in our yoga teacher or in a yoga studio. Episode 382, Rebecca Sebastian was here talking about having tough conversations with friends. Her and I literally have one live for you where we really talk about how to have these tough conversations and the importance of that. Muna was on the podcast on episode 376 talking about collective care over individualistic self-care. Billy Smith was here talking about struggling to write content in episode 369. Molly Nixon, who is a yoga teacher who teaches to refugee communities. And Molly's really been on my mind this week as we're watching a lot of the news out of Syria. And if you have a listen to that episode, you'll know why. Molly talks about yoga in times of war and violence. That's episode 362. I did a bonus episode, Yoga for Peace. I'll link to that as well. Suzanne Miller. Oh my gosh, I remember this episode so well. Suzanne came and talked about what it felt like as a yoga student when a yoga teacher was completely silent and ignored her feelings right now. That was episode 356. And Rula, oh my gosh, Rula from Jordan came on and talked about ahimsa in times of conflict in episode 359. We've done a ton of episodes, and you know what, Connected Yoga teachers, we're still doing these because it is very much yoga when we are looking at what's happening in the world. If you are ever wondering about a question, if you're like, Shannon, I've listened to all those episodes, but I need help with like something completely different. You know, let's say you need help with a microphone so you can teach online, or you really want to find out a bit of insurance or the 5 koshas or something yoga philosophy, go to our website and use the search bar. That is how I find episodes. That's how Crunch finds episodes when she's writing our show notes, I'm sure. You can always search on our website and look for past episodes that we've done on similar topics. Today, I am so excited that you're here to listen. We're going to chat with Dr. Sheena Sood, who's going to join us with some really powerful insights and questions and things to think further on. Sheena is a Philadelphia-based activist, educator, sociologist, and healing justice visionary of South Asian descent. She's an assistant professor of sociology at Delaware Valley University in Pennsylvania and has studied yoga at Kailash Tribal School of Yoga in India. She's going to talk about that on the podcast today. Her current research project is about Omwashing Yoga, Weaponized Spirituality in India, Israel, and the US, where she investigates the growing incorporation of yoga and mindfulness by far-right law enforcement, military, and vigilante groups. Sheena also curates decolonizing yoga workshops through frameworks that recognize yoga's oppressive layers and liberatory potential. And she's the founder and creative director of Yoga Warrior Tales, which is an interactive, adventure-based educational program that teaches children yoga and mindfulness through a social justice lens. I love this. This is where we really can make some big change when we start to teach yoga to children, but also I love that there's a social justice lens there as well. In our conversation today, you're going to hear Sheena's commentary on the situation in Palestine and how the yoga world has reacted to it, why this isn't unexpected, and how we as yoga practitioners, teachers, and studios can counter harmful narratives to support Palestine. Also, I want to say harmful narratives that really actually are also doing harm to all of us, as well as yoga. I learned so much from Sheena, and I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation so that you can also learn. So let's dig in and meet Sheena. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Sheena. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you, Shannon, for inviting me on the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. And I'm really excited to get to know you and your audience today.
I am so grateful that you're here to have this conversation about, what we can do as yoga teachers who are wanting to speak up right now for any social justice, but specifically for Palestine right now, because we have a lot of yoga teachers who are feeling isolated in this or feeling like, why isn't my studio speaking up? Or why are my yoga friends saying, like, let's not take sides. But before we get into that conversation, tell our listeners if they don't already know you, what's the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Yeah, thank you. So I would identify myself as a healing justice practitioner. I'm Desi or of South Asian origin, and I was born and raised in the US South. But right now, I currently live on the unceded territories, first inhabited and cared for or stewarded by the Lenni Lenape people. So, yeah, I live in Philadelphia, what's presently known as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And a little bit of the work that I do is I'm a yoga teacher and practitioner. I teach and I teach decolonizing yoga workshops for yoga teacher training programs. I'm the co-founder of Yogis for Palestine, which is a collective that actually emerged in 2021, around June 2021. So it's about 3 years old, a lot more active as of recently. And I'm a scholar practitioner, so I'm trained as a sociologist. And I do a lot of research around the politics of yoga, or what I call also the weaponization of yoga by the far right and by ethno states. And so I put this research under a body of work called Omwashing. And then finally, it's slowly emerging, but I have a kids yoga program called Yoga Warrior Tales. And the way that I like to think about uh, the connection between my research and the kids yoga program is that my research looks at the weaponization of yoga, while the kids yoga program represents something that I hope can be an abolitionist lens or a more liberatory way of offering political education and mindful movement to our young folks.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much that you're doing the research and learning. And we'll get into this weaponization of yoga because someone might be like, wait a second, like, how can you weaponize something that's like relaxing and breath and meditation? Like, how could that be possible? But I love that you're also looking at, okay, what can we do? Like, how can we get um, education out there to the next generation so that they will definitely be able to see it? I love this, that it has a social justice lens. So, first, why don't we start with the definition of ohm washing? Like this, So this is the weaponization of yoga. Like, how is that even a thing?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess one of the ways I'm wondering whether it'd be helpful for your audience to think about washing in the context of a story. Um, I I mentioned that I'm of South Asian origin, and the first time I went to go do my yoga teacher training, I went back to India to do my yoga teacher training in a place called McLeodganj, India, which is in Himachal Pradesh in the Himalaya region of India. And it's also called Upper Dharamshala. It's kind of a town of what some people might call like one that attracts a lot of spiritual tourists. And so I went there to study yoga in 2011 and I went back in 2013. And I remember thinking that I remember thinking when I went back to Himachal Pradesh or Dharamshala to study yoga that I was definitely going to be surrounded by a lot of tourists, whether of European origin or US, like American white origin. And I remember having to like prep myself for that, right? Like you're going to your homeland to practice yoga and you want this decolonial experience, but it may not be that, right? But one of the things that I found really surprising when I went to go study yoga was I found all the things I expected, right? I was the only brown person in my yoga teacher training program. Uh, the second time and the first time, there was one other South Asian yoga practitioner who was learning with me. But one of the things that I was deeply surprised by that I did not expect to see was that there were a lot of tourists who had recently left the Israeli military who were flocking to these towns near Dharamshala or McLeodganj, enough to the point where the locals had nicknamed some of the towns that they lived in and settled in Little Israel or Mini Israel. And a lot of them had come right after their compulsory military service. And they were using yoga, meditation, Reiki, all these different kind of new age spirituality practices to treat their PTSD uh, and to, meditate their way out of committing violence. And I don't think I quite had the analysis yet to kind of pinpoint that as a social phenomenon or a problem at that time, but I remember feeling deeply uncomfortable about meeting them and uh, their kind of lack of an analysis or their limited analysis of um, their role in perpetuating the colonial violence in Palestine. And it wasn't until later that I came back and started putting a few things together of like, kind of reckoning with my own upper caste identity or caste supremacist kind of identity. I am not a Brahmin, but I am of an upper caste background. It wasn't until like, I kind of was forced to reckon with, okay, what are the ways in which the far right in India, Hindu supremacists, kind of use yoga as a tool to make themselves look peaceful? What are the ways in which the Israeli military, in this instance, but also if we see the videos that are circulating of them using yoga as protests to bring attention to the hostages, without actually talking about uh, the apartheid system and the colonial violence that they are perpetuating. Like, how are they using yoga to make themselves look peaceful, to make themselves and their society look like they are the perpetual victims, and to make their society look attractive, right? And so building on the research of folks who've done like work on pinkwashing and work on greenwashing, right? My scholarship looks specifically at not just India and Israel, it also looks at the US and how is it that within the US they're taking on yoga programs in the military and in policing, right? These structurally violent institutions that are predicated on state and colonial violence, right? That are predicated on ideologies of state violence and apartheid rule and racist systems. How is it that they're kind of incorporating yoga programs to make themselves look like they're reformative and to distract the public from their violent and supremacist agendas, which are often colonial, which are often predicated on ethnic cleansing, and how do they use it as a way to, as like a soft power kind of diplomatic tactic, right? So that the rest of the world kind of is like, oh, look, Modi can't be violent because he does yoga. And Israelis, look at them, they're doing yoga. And so, we have to sympathize with them as opposed to kind of seeing it as propaganda. And so I think omwashing is kind of the term for how it is that, the global far right and these ethno states and cultural institutions use yoga as propaganda to make themselves look peaceful or like um, uh, liberatory to the public. But in fact, it's kind of disguising their violent agendas.
Thank you so much for rooting that in that story. You're not the first yoga teacher that I've talked to who said, like, wow, there was a huge amount of IDF or IOF soldiers in my yoga teacher training. And I had a friend who, like, I knew who went to yoga teacher training who talked about uh, the harm that she experienced being an IDF soldier. And still the indoctrination is there in that I kind of saw her messages come out around the time of October the 7th and saw like the focus only be about the hostages. And not about like, okay, how do we get here? How do Palestinians actually live? How are they in this, what I would say is an enclosed concentration camp being, um, having their resources taken, having their land taken, and that wasn't explained. So I'm curious if you had some awareness. When was your yoga teacher training, and did you have some awareness of Palestine and the history of Palestine going into that yoga teacher training?
Yeah, I would say it was I was definitely aware that Palestine was an ongoing project of settler colonialism at that time. And I had seen the maps of the ways in which Israel had been colonizing Palestine since 1947. And so I had some awareness. I came up through movement organizing, through interning at the Highlander Research and Education Center and working for liberatory and leftist movements, or at least volunteering for and kind of coming up through. I think my first Palestine protest was maybe in 2008, and my yoga teacher training was 2011, and then in 2013. And so I remember having these uncomfortable conversations with people I had met who I found out were in the IOF, the Israeli occupation force. But I don't think my analysis was nowhere near it is now. And in 2019, I actually did go visit a friend in Palestine and was able to have an experiential, right? Like a kind of on the grounds kind of experience of witnessing uh, the militarization of the apartheid wall, right? And going to the occupied West Bank and going to parts of Hebron and really just seeing what does Israeli what is the impact of these settlements? What are the impacts of Israeli occupation, and how does this militarized border wall impact the daily lives of Palestinians, right? So I think now it's at this place where I have a much more grounded analysis, and I've read a lot more about the history of the settler colonial occupation. Yeah, and I think per your mentioning of your you didn't I don't think you said your friend, but like or maybe you did say your friend, but someone who had served in the IOF, right? And them talking a little bit about their experience in the military, right? I think the reality of PTSD is real for anyone who's served in dehumanizing uh kind of institutions such as the military and such as policing, right? So I think PTSD is very real for people who have had to participate in dehumanizing other populations, right? And I think what you're also alluding to is that for Palestinians who live under occupation, however, there's no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder, especially not during a genocide. There is persistent traumatic stress disorder, right? Where or a persistent traumatic stress environment, as one scholar, Sean Ginwright, kind of has alluded to in his work on healing justice, right? And I think the difference between that, right, is stark, because what gets attention because of Western media, because of how it is that Zionism is, or how it is that Israel is kind of showcased to the world as, having a right to defend, is that the PTSD of Israelis on October 7th is what we hear about um, nonstop, while we barely hear about the 75 or 76 plus year occupation that Palestinians have endured, right? Or the siege on Gaza that predicated October 7th, or the ethnic cleansing through the Nakba that Palestinians had to endure, that left their diaspora across the Middle East and across the world as refugees, right? And I think that's the persistent traumatic stress environment that um, that when we think about yoga and omwashing, that gets left out, right? Um, because of, yeah, just this framework that we're given to understand trauma is so limited.
Yeah. And I appreciate you also using the example of, I saw this video. And so if our listeners didn't see it, I'll try and explain it. There was a video of a large group. To me, it looked like white women practicing yoga with a photo of a hostage beside them. And it was very much like in support of Israel. And I remember just getting this really terrible feeling watching this video, and a yoga teacher sent it to me and being like, and it was a Jewish yoga teacher friend who sent it to me saying, "Ew, I can't. This is not what yoga is about." Even though it looks, if someone's like, "Well, these people are doing this as a way to speak out for the families of the hostages," and they're not saying anything about what Palestinians are living through, or they're not saying anything about the thousands of hostages in Israeli prisons. Um,
Yeah.
and that really stuck with me. That's a great example of, like, on a large scale, this weaponization. But I guess I want to dig into, how do you see this showing up in our small yoga spaces, like a studio or a yoga teacher? What are some of the ways that we see Om washing where we might be doing it? You know, we're steeped in it. So what are the smaller examples of that? And do you have any thoughts on that video as well?
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Um, so I definitely do see it showing up in yoga studios, but I think I'll address the second question you asked first. It was really interesting to kind of, just like, it was outrageous, right? Or it was enraging to kind of watch that video. I think largely because, you know, the global connotation, or the popular connotation rather, that we get around yoga is that it is inherently peaceful, inherently positive, inherently liberatory, right? And inherently calming. And I think one of the aspects that we miss out on as it relates to yoga is yoga is a practice of self-awareness, right? Yoga is a practice that deepens our connection to ourself. It also deepens our connection, if we would like it to our own ancestral traumas, not just the ancestral traumas that we have experienced or our lineages have experienced, but also the ancestral traumas that our ancestors have participated in, right? And so, as an upper caste person, as someone who comes from a Hindu lineage in a country that, or sorry, I don't live in India, right? But from whose origins are from India, and I see the Hindu nationalist violence taking place in this moment, I think yoga, if I'm doing yoga according to the ethics that I want to kind of live up to, then yoga invites me to kind of reckon with the violence my ancestors and my relatives might be participating in, right? And that could be, linguistic violence. It doesn't have to be physical violence, right? It could be rhetorical violence as well. Um, and so I think when I see that video, right, I think those yoga practitioners, right, as they're practicing to bring home the hostages, right, they're participating in this form of escapism. They're participating in this form of like spiritual bypass by choosing to only see the humanity and the victimhood of their fellow Israelis, right? And they're not choosing to let that yoga be a practice that helps them connect with the harm that their Zionist ancestors have participated in order to create the catastrophe of the Nakba, the catastrophe of the settler colonial violence, and the ethnic cleansing that led to October 7th, right? And so I think there's like a missed opportunity, right? And that happens so often in yoga because of the way in which it's commodified and used by the Western world and around the globe a as this kind of tool that only gets us to these surface level notions of peace, not the depth of what liberation and revolutionary change is going to look like in our society. And so yeah, I think that was a deeply troubling video to watch, because it's an example of how yoga is used by dominant culture, right, um, to basically highlight the suffering and the trauma of one group of people, the at the top of the hierarchy, at the expense of these marginalized Palestinians. I think I've forgotten the second question now.
If it's okay, I'd like to jump in for a moment and then we'll come back to the second part of that question.
Yeah.
Because this is bringing up someone who I was in conversation with early on, and a few conversations actually, people with connections and ties to Israel, strong ones. Either they live there or they had family there or they had visited there, would say, my people. My people are being attacked. My people this. Like, I kept hearing it in the language. And I just said at one point, who do you think my people are? Like, here I am saying, I want Palestinians to be free. I want them to have all of the freedoms that I have, that Israelis have. And can you just define who my people are? Like, I'm Canadian. So do you think my people are Canadian? Like all my people, and I defend all of Canadians no matter what they do? No. I really feel like my people are my global community of people around the whole world. And so we had this whole conversation. So I appreciate you. I just want to add that in. And the kind of the
Mm.
other part of the question
Yoga.
is what about our studios and how are we doing this? How might I, as a white, able-bodied cis woman living in a colonized country on stolen land in Canada, how might I be washing on a micro level?
Yeah. Um, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think, the trick of racial and ethnic and religious constructs is that it teaches us to kind of group ourselves and our community and who we think we identify with by these socially constructed categories, right? And so we think our people equals, what these hierarchies have taught us to identify with, and then we subscribe to borders and subscribe to colonial borders and uh, these groups that don't actually seek to protect us in the end, right? So thank you for sharing that. I think the ways in which we might think about, in this moment, yoga studios and how they're showing up is, right after October 7th is very different than where we are now, right? But I think right after October 7th was a very telling moment for how confused yoga studios were. I'm really lucky to live in West Philadelphia where I had a yoga studio where, I'm part of a yoga studio called Studio 34 um, that has invited me to do decolonizing yoga workshops for a really long time, and where I've been able to talk about the framework of Omwashing with a lot of the trainees who've come up through there. And a lot of the time, and so they've shown up in really honorable ways, right? They've hosted fundraiser yoga classes for advocacy organizations for families in Gaza. Through Yogis for Palestine, we've been able to do some amazing fundraisers. They also hosted an art exhibit for 2 months of a friend of mine who basically showcased her pictures from the apartheid wall. This photo exhibit is called Lala Lil Jidar for anyone who wants to check it out. And we hosted a number of conversations throughout those 2 months, whether it was hosting poets or artists, a conversation on omwashing, yoga fundraiser classes, burlesque shows, everything, right? So that's been like a really beautiful thing to experience, is to see a yoga studio that is willing to recognize all of these cultural and artistic traditions have political implications, right? So as much as we may choose to see and say yoga is not political, right? I think that's a really problematic statement, because everything, every action that we take as people who are living in a society that is deeply violent in on a land that, as you mentioned, has a colonial history. All of us, as much as my parents immigrated here and my grandparents immigrated here, I am still a settler. And it's important for me to acknowledge and sit with my settler identity, right? Um and so, a lot of the yoga studios that I think uh after October 7th kind of were very different from Studio 34. One of the ways in which I saw them showing up that was really hurtful, especially even ones that invited me to do decolonizing yoga workshops that had Black Lives Matter flags hanging on their windows, was to bow down to their, you know, Zionist um, yoga clients, right? Who any mention of the history prior to October 7th, right? They would get really um, kind of two-sided around, right? We can't choose sides. We have to remain neutral. Let's just keep our yoga political. Let's pray for Palestine, or let's pray for both sides. Let's pray for the Israeli hostages, and let's pray for the Palestinians under occupation. And they probably wouldn't even say under occupation, right? And so there was this kind of catering to both sides that I think was happening. And suddenly a lot of these yoga studios, some of which, talked about decolonization, got really worried about their business clientele and whether or not they were going to lose their business. They were afraid to take a stance. And that just felt really troubling, right? I mean, it's on the one hand, it's not surprising because a lot of businesses that are, that exist in a capitalist society that, is unwilling to reckon with its colonial and racist past, would do the same thing or are doing the same thing. I think with yoga studios in particular, right? It can be really tough to see the ways in which a lot of yoga studios and yoga studio owners kind of hope that the peace and light, pray for Palestine method is going to actually do something, when we know that the only thing that has worked historically to transform the conditions of oppression, colonial oppression, have been material action, right? Has been protests and social movements that have been relentless. And it was just really, I think it was just really sad to see some of that happen. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to kind of add on to your question. I know one thing that's kind of maybe tangentially related, right, is that whenever I do these decolonizing yoga workshops and I ask students at the beginning, I say, what is it that you are here for? Why is decolonizing yoga important to you? And a lot of them will have these answers, which make sense because of the way in which the rhetoric on decolonizing yoga has, I think, been kind of, I don't know if it's falsely co-opted, but what gets attention on decolonizing yoga is, let's get more BIPOC people. Let's get more Black, Indigenous, people of color in these yoga studios, and then everything will be okay. Or, let's learn yoga the authentic way, right? The real cultural roots of yoga are this, and then there's this kind of plug-in application of yoga is 5,000 years old. This is how people did sun salutations this long ago. So I think there's this kind of revisionist history that gets applied, and this plug and play kind of method of decolonizing yoga that a lot of these trainees kind of don't realize is still perpetuating the weaponization of yoga, right? So, I mean, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a brown yoga teacher, and he is actively mainstreaming a very fascist agenda in India. He's a brown yoga teacher. Should we invite him to our yoga studios, right? That's kind of what the solution becomes, right? And so one of the ways in which I think these yoga studios participate in omwashing is in these unfortunate ways in which they think they're trying to be well-intentioned and decolonial, but they actually are only just doing this diversity and inclusion approach that is not actually anti-colonial and that is not anti-imperial. And we see it show up, right, in the case of this yoga studio that I, previously deeply admired, because they would invite me in to do decolonizing yoga workshops, and they had this Black Lives Matter flag, and they had this poster of Marilyn Buck, an anti racist, race traitor. And then when it came time to Palestine, they held a conversation that was very both sidesy, and then closed the door on that to kind of make it seem as if they were doing something. It was a very performative kind of way of addressing the problem, but not doing what I was saying earlier around like, how can we use yoga as a vehicle and as a tool to really dig deep into the colonial trauma that we're witnessing coming to the surface right now within our own families and lineages and in the genocidal violence that we're witnessing and that we are complicit in as taxpayers, as a country who is arming Israel.
This is so good. Thank you for all of this. I'm just sitting here like so many thoughts are rolling through my brain right now. Hey, connected yoga teachers, I'm popping in here for a moment to talk about our amazing sponsor, OfferingTree. And I wanted to tell you about a really recent webinar that I was part of. Billy Smith was leading the webinar, and they did a fantastic job of really educating yoga teachers and studios in the hour-long webinar. And it's free, and you can grab the replay, and I'll make sure that we link to that in the show notes, or you can go to offeringtree.com/webinars. Always, you can go there. You can find out about webinars that are coming up. You can look for past ones. They have all kinds of topics. In this one that Billy was teaching us in, they were really talking about how we can make our yoga classes more inclusive and really talking about how we can take out gendered language when it isn't necessary, which is so often in yoga classes. So if you've ever said to a student, hey, like put your block at the level of your bra strap, or if you've ever said, and for those of you who are menstruating, you will not want to do this pose. There are some different things that we can say in a yoga class to really be inclusive. And it's a continuing conversation. I loved the questions that came up. I loved the yoga teachers that were there and shared comments. I heard afterward from one yoga teacher who said, like, this was so helpful, so relevant, and I could have listened to Billy for 5 hours, that the hour went by really quickly. And if you're thinking, oh gosh, I do want to listen to Billy for 5 hours, I think their training is actually 5 hours long that they're putting together, and we'll link to it in the show notes as well. So I'll link to the webinar so you can sign up for the webinar. I'm asking the questions to Billy, who's a fantastic teacher. I love how they shared with such vulnerability why this work is so important and important for everyone. Whether or not you're leading a class that is specific to the queer community, or if you are leading a class and someone from the queer community is in your class, which will be all of us really at some point. So this is a way to make your spaces a little bit safer, hopefully safer, and definitely more inclusive. So check that out in the show notes. And the show notes for today's episode are over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/386. And one big thing I want to note here is OfferingTree made all of this possible. This webinar they put together, they hosted it, they organized to have Billy there, they organized to have me there asking Billy questions. And this is a company that really cares about yoga teachers in studios and teaching them different workshops and things like how to run your business or how to make yoga more inclusive. So many topics are covered by them, which is amazing. And if you're thinking, okay, I really want to go check this out, make sure to go over to offeringtree.com. And if you're thinking, well, actually, I'd like to sign up for OfferingTree and create my website or have a place where I can book people in or they can pay me online or where I can start a membership and store my yoga videos. They have an amazing software that does all of this. And get our discount code if you are thinking about signing up. It's a nice one just for our podcast listeners. That's over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. Okay, let's get back into today's episode with Sheena. Well, I know one of my first posts that came out was sort of a question I was throwing out there, but also I was like, look, I can feel and speak for my Israeli friends, and also I can feel and speak for my Palestinian friends. And I was so guarded when I first started talking about it. I had looked into the history of Palestine for a few years, just touched on it. So I felt like I wasn't I definitely wasn't a historian. I definitely didn't go and live there. And so I get the feeling of like, oh wait, like let's not hurt anyone's feelings. That's a I've been raised well as a white woman in this society of like, let's just be nice. Let's not ruffle any feathers.
Mhm.
Let's all get along. And especially in the yoga world. And what I'm hearing you say is really important of like, we're not going to make change if we go and sit and meditate and then we're nice to all of our neighbors who might be walking around saying really racist things like or being horrible to their trans kid. Like we are only going to make change when we get louder about it and say that's not okay. You actually can't do this with my tax money. I'm going to protest. I'm going to do lots of things that are going to disrupt your life until you see that this is important to me. So I appreciate you saying like that. That's what I'm hearing anyway, and that's what I've heard in your message all along of like we really have to look at what doing yoga is right now in this moment. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And in ways how it's used to pacify struggles that are legitimate. Um, yeah, I mean, um, as a historian or as a sociologist who has studied history and the history of social movements, right? I think one thing to really reckon with is that no oppressed and formerly colonized society has ever won a struggle against their oppressor simply through like nonviolent peaceful resistance, and that includes India, even though the narrative that is often told is that Gandhi fought off the British through nonviolent struggle. That's a lie that we are fed, right? The lies that we are told historically about social change in society, including in America, is that, there was a white savior or someone just suddenly came into their moral conscience. And and the truth is that enslaved people in America made it impossible for slavery to continue, right? Is that these liberation movements that were fed up with the violence and systemic oppression that they were experiencing uh, chose to take up resistance in a way to where the oppressors um, could no longer afford to maintain their violent system of oppression in that way, right? And I think when we see yoga being co-opted by the far right, or when people are told like, oh, you're too angry, go do some yoga, right? Go do some meditation because you keep posting or you keep, drawing attention to this issue. You're the problem, right? I think that just means that as a society, right, where it just shows how indoctrinated we are into um, not actually knowing how crucial social movements are to the transformation of society, and how some of that change that we're looking for is not going to happen through electoral politics. It's not going to happen within the system, but how so much of it is connected to what are the organizations that you are connected to outside of this uh, this system and this political environment. Yeah.
What are some of the things that what are some of the actions? Like if a yoga teacher is listening or a yoga studio and they're like, you know what? I've been posting, I've been calling my rep, I've been, and they're taking small steps and they're starting to feel like isolated in it or a bit hopeless. Like I've gone through moments where I'm like, is anything I'm doing making a difference? And I will say, then someone will reach out and be like, "Oh my gosh, I just heard this podcast, and that really made me feel like inspired me to do this thing." And so I will tell you that it every tiny little bit makes a difference.
Yeah.
But what would you say? Like, what are some of the actions, or what is the mindset that
Mhm.
you think would be helpful to keep us motivated and to keep going?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I definitely think that the reposting and sharing of stories that are coming directly from people in the occupied West Bank and in Gaza right now is, the bare minimum, but also really important and essential, right? And I read something today that said, like, I was afraid of this moment 9 months from now that people were going to get burnt out and like the actions were going to stop. And that breaks my heart. And that broke my heart to read that, right? Because I know so many of us are exhausted. And so I think continuing to amplify the voices of Palestinians and those who are living in Gaza and the occupied West Bank right now, and part of the Palestinian diaspora. I think getting our yoga studios to uh, sign on in some way to support, right? To kind of be really open and vocal and willing to take a risk, right? Around naming their solidarity with Palestinians right now, I think is a really important step, because I think the goal is to delegitimize Zionism, right? Zionism is a settler colonial ideology that's predicated on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, right? Zionism is not an innocent ideology, it's predicated on genocide. And as much as we might say, as much as we might hear people say Israel has a right to defend itself, as an occupying army, as an occupying state, it does not have the right to defend itself, right? Palestinians and Gazans have had the right to resist their occupation, their military occupation. And that is, justified under legal code, international humanitarian law. And so I think getting our yoga studios to be willing to take a risk, which I know is not easy, is really important. The way I see the yoga classes that we have been hosting as part of Yogis for Palestine, the purpose of them is not to just come do yoga and say like, okay, we did a good job, we are standing up for Palestine, right? It's been to the purpose is to fortify ourselves so that we can show up at the actions, so that we can continue to show up at the actions, and to kind of pull in other people who maybe otherwise wouldn't go to these actions, but to say like, oh, there's a community of yoga teachers here who actually see their yoga as political and who see it as important for yogis to have a voice on this, because we see the ways in which yoga is weaponized by the far right. Last week was International Day of Yoga, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi did his Yoga Day action, the 10th annual one, I think, at in Kashmir, occupied Kashmir. Yeah. And Prime Minister Modi right now is being so emboldened by Israel's ethno-national violence because it's allowing him to feel emboldened to further occupy Kashmir, which he's been doing since he became prime minister, but more actively since he got his second term, and then now that he has his third term, right? So the Yoga Day action that he did in Kashmir was not innocent, right? It was to make a statement of, further ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Kashmir, and it's to advance a Hindu supremacist agenda. And so last week, and every year Tel Aviv hosts an International Day of Yoga, right? And so one of the things that we did as Yogis for Palestine was we hosted an International Day of Yoga action in Philly for Palestinian liberation. And we came together. We have some really beautiful shirts. We're fundraising and selling those for families in Gaza, or for a family in Gaza right now. We'll probably be releasing those to the public to kind of support if they want to add to the fundraiser soon. But I think, maybe even wearing those shirts in public would be one way. They say yogis call for a free Palestine. They were designed by a dear friend of mine, Just Know. So I think, all that to say that when we are doing our yoga, I think sitting with the contradictions of what does it mean to be if we are people who are listening in and we are settlers on occupied land, what does it mean to say, like, okay, as a settler, what is my right and what is my duty? What is like my dharmic duty? And that might be to, fight for Indigenous rights in our local community. And it might mean showing up to these actions and participating in movements and organizations that are calling for the unapologetic liberation of Palestine, for, a way out of this apartheid system, a way out of colonization, and calling for the delegitimization of Zionist ideology, right? Which I know might be a leap for many yoga teachers who have these quote unquote Israeli friends, or who have sympathy for victims of October 7th. And I think it's still a really important step, because we have to really understand that this violence didn't start on October 7th, and it's much deeper than that. And I think part of the work of yoga is to be uncomfortable, and to really use that discomfort to move ourselves into action. And for the people who sympathize with Israel or with Zionism, I think there are many organizations, anti-Zionist Jewish networks, that can help resource you to be able to find belonging and connection to a way of understanding your lineage and your practice and your religious practice in ways that do not have to be predicated on the dehumanization and genocide of Palestinians, right? Because we can't lie to ourselves, and we can't let Zionism be used as a tool to lie to ourselves that there is like some sort of way in which we're going to be able to have Zionism and a free Palestine, because Zionism is predicated on the dehumanization of Palestinian people.
Oh my gosh, there's so much there. Thank you for I want to know how we can order the shirts and put that in the show notes. Like, I have so many thoughts now. Mostly I'm really grateful that you're doing this work, that you were doing this work before October the 7th, that you're educating on this to yoga teachers. I remember seeing a post that I'm pretty sure your organization created. It was an image of someone with a yoga mat strapped to them and a machine gun, and it really caught my attention of like, okay, what is the message that's going on here? What is actually happening? Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
And then the
it's
images coming out of Gaza of Israeli soldiers practicing yoga after they've bombed homes, right? They're doing yoga in the same homes where they have bombed and displaced Palestinians, right? And yeah, it's really disturbing to see those images. And I think one of the things I invite yoga teachers to see, right? A lot of us want to point fingers and say that's not yoga. And I actually push back on the idea that that's not yoga, and I say unfortunately that is yoga. And that's
right.
something we have to reckon with, right? Yoga can make you stronger in what you think your purpose is. And if you think that your purpose is to be part of an army that is occupying and dehumanizing and genociding a population, unfortunately, when you do those breath practices and you do those posture practices, you might get better at your job. at what you think your purpose is. And I think that as much as we may want to believe that's not true yoga, I think I always come back to this idea that like, or this understanding that like, even in India, yoga has historically been used as a weapon, right? For upper caste Brahmins to justify their oppression, right? Sanskrit, these chants that we, often recite, or these mantras that we often recite, have been used as weapons to dehumanize lower caste Dalit and Bahujan populations. And that unfortunately is a part of yoga's history that we have to reckon with. Yoga is not inherently this pure practice that we see circulating as peaceful in the world. And unfortunately, when we see those images, we have to say, yeah, maybe that's not the yoga I ascribe to, but it is probably making them better at this brutal massacre that they are participating in.
It's making me think of the use of religion as well, or so many tools can be weaponized, something that could be beneficial and positive and give someone a purpose and a connection to something outside of themselves can also be used as a weapon. Thank you for sharing that. That really that's something I hadn't thought of. Like I would I it was on the tip of my tongue to feel like that's not yoga. That can't be yoga. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. We can all sit with that and think on it. Like what is yoga right now? And we're seeing lots of things where we think that's not yoga and speaking up and yeah. Where do our listeners learn more from you? Where should they go?
Um, Thanks for asking. Thanks for this conversation and just allowing me to indulge um, some of the musings, yeah, and experiences from practicing. So, again, my name is Sheena Sood. You can find me on Instagram at Sheena_shining. You could also follow Yoga Warrior Tales if you do have little ones. I'll hopefully be releasing a season full of episodes for little ones that kind of merge political education and yoga. You can definitely follow Yogis for Palestine. You can sign our solidarity statement if you identify as a yoga teacher or as a yoga studio or yoga institution. And um, yeah, I think I have a website, sheenashining.com as well. Barely updated, but you're welcome to message us at Yogis for Palestine on Instagram, and hopefully we'll have that information up on the t-shirts and be able to, yeah, just put them out in the world and help these families in Gaza. And so,
Mhm. Every little bit of that matters. I am a volunteer hike leader, and the organization was like, "Oh, we don't do anything political," like, because I brought something up, like, "Maybe this" and someone said, "Yeah, the organization won't do anything political, but I can wear my Free Palestine shirt while I'm leading hikes, and nobody can say I can't wear that." And I'm telling you, the conversations now of people coming up to me and saying, like, "Thank you so much for wearing that shirt," or "I love that shirt," or like, "I was supposed to go visit Palestine this week," and like the conversations that come out of it are pretty amazing. So, to the yoga teachers who are feeling like you're isolated, you're not. I mean, the system is set up to make you feel that way. You're not. I love how Sheena, you brought up like it's not you when you're thinking, what is wrong here? Like, and the finger is being pointed at the yoga teacher who's like, I have to post these things. Like, I have to make sure people see this. Um, Yeah. thank you for pointing that out, that like it's this system that we live in where people are being oppressed and don't have the freedom, and we're seeing it, we're witnessing it, and we're calling it out. Um, yeah, anything else that you'd want to say in closing to yoga teachers who are in this with us?
Mhm. I think the only thing is I want to give a special shout out to my collaborator, Anika Anwar. I meant to mention that much earlier, but just also been like an extremely crucial backbone in this work and being able to facilitate some of the Omwashing and Zionism teachings that we've been doing. We did one with ABCD Yogi, and it's up on YouTube for folks who want to check it out. Um, and and yeah, and I think that in this work we really need community, right? We really need people who hear us, see us, aren't going to gaslight us, and who can help take the load and the lift off of our shoulders at times when it feels like burnout is so close and and touching our hearts. And so I just want to encourage folks to not numb yourself and as we continue to see these images and think they can't get any worse. And to yeah, just continue to find ways to let your heart feel what it is that you're witnessing, and to check out the resources that can help you have a deeper education of the history of Palestine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon.
Alrighty, connected yoga teachers, I want to hear from you. What were your thoughts, questions, ideas as you listen to today's episode? Thank you again, Sheena, for all of this information and for the work that you're doing in the world. It's really something that you are looking at. How is yoga being weaponized? How is it being used in a way that's actually really harmful, which goes against everything that yoga is? I'm curious to know, connected yoga teachers, if you've been told or if you felt that you should stay out of politics or not take sides. I'm curious if you've had messages come across that say, like, you're so angry, you should do yoga or meditate or be more mindful. I don't think those messages are helping in any way. I think they're quite harmful. Yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you want to share your thoughts right on our website, if you have a comment that you want to type out, you can go to the connectedyogateacher.com/386 and you can leave a comment there and everyone can read it and reply to you right on our website. Or you can leave a voice message if you want to send that to us directly. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com, and there's a button there on our homepage to leave a voice message. Or maybe you want to join the conversation in our Facebook group, which is a private group of global yoga teachers. There's like over 10,000 yoga teachers from around the world in there. And you can start a conversation and say, hey, I was listening to episode 386 with Sheena Sood, and here are my thoughts and questions, and I want to continue the conversation. That's a super supportive place if you want to hang out and chat in there as well. Alrighty, connected yoga teachers, I have a personal update to share with you if you're still here and have time to listen to that. So many of you know that I sold Pelvic Health Professionals, the membership. Nancy is running with it and doing amazing interviews over there and really putting some love and energy into that membership, which is exciting. So you can still join Pelvic Health Professionals if you're like, hey, I want to see this like 5 years of information that Shannon created and the continuation of it now. It's still available over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And the reason why I sold it was something else was calling to me, which is really talking about gardening, growing food, thinking about like possibly selling food at a little farm market. And all of these ideas are bubbling up. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I just know that I'm very interested in getting people out in nature, working in person in some capacity that way, talking to people about how we can grow food and share food, and how food and pollinator plants and weeds and herbs and all kinds of plants that grow can be so great for us, but also for the planet and the critters that live on the planet with us. So that work is really it's calling to me. Again, I had a farmer's market for 5 years. So many of you know this if you've been listening to the podcast for a while. And as the snow started to fall near the end of November, beginning of December, and we get a lot of snow where I live up here in Canada, I started to feel like, oh gosh, I think I need to get out of the house. I think I need to go work somewhere a couple days a week where I don't make the decisions. I don't go home at night thinking about it, rolling it over, waking up in the night or in the morning. I don't usually wake up in the night. I sleep pretty soundly, but waking up in the morning thinking, oh my gosh, I have to do this thing, which is what happens when you're an entrepreneur. And so I took on this job as an elf. Now, please understand that I'm not dressing as an elf, although I do wear Christmassy things. But I'm working at a family-owned olive oil business that's local. It's local. I know the owners, and I'm telling you, connected yoga teachers, I am loving it because I get to leave the house 2 days a week, go see people, interact, look at my work. I've done a lot of work on the computer and you can't always see it, but now I can be there it is. All my work is right there, visual at the end of the day, or really interact with people, which I love doing. And I'm learning so much about olives and olive oil. And I'm getting to try so many different types of olive oil, balsamic vinegars. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. It's amazing to geek out about a product. And I'm learning all the health benefits of olive oil and how it's used medicinally. And I highly recommend finding, if you have one in your area, or we do ship online if you want to check it out. It's called the Southampton Olive Oil Company. I'll link to it in the show notes. If you're I want to try some, I want to order some, you definitely can. And it's really made me think, hey, I want to talk about it on the podcast. So if you have any questions for me, reach out and let me know. Basically, I've been working as an entrepreneur, self-employed, for 20 years, not working for anyone else for 20 years. And so to go to a job where I'm getting a paycheck and I'm clocking in and clocking out is the wildest feeling after 20 years of being an entrepreneur. I'm noticing so much. This company is run really well, really smoothly. I love the people there. And there's always something to learn about how someone runs a company. So it's been fascinating for me. I'm hired on right now as an elf until Christmas, getting everything ready. And we're busy packaging things up for online orders and big orders for Christmas and all the things. Anyway, I wanted to update you on that. And also a couple of episodes, I put it right, in the middle of the episode, I've been going through a separation. And so I feel like this is a good way for me to just really shake things up and, be around people and be social and have something completely different to focus on. And a couple days a week, the time goes by so fast working there. It's helping. It's helping. So I guess I want to say, whatever you're doing, if you feel like there's something, I'm an entrepreneur at heart. It's made me really appreciate working for myself, going to work 2 days a week. I really realized the privilege and the potential again of my own business, if that makes sense. And I just knew I needed some kind of a shift. I needed to get out of the house a couple days a week. So if you have some idea like this, connected yoga teachers, or if you're oh gosh, I do that already. I work 5 days a week or 7 days a week somewhere else. And I want to figure out how to be self-employed more or stay at home more. Really follow that inner voice. Reach out if you need support with doing that. I love to support yoga teachers in studios. I'm still doing a little bit of consultation call work. I will be talking about that more in an upcoming email. I keep promising it. What's happening now is I'm just getting people reaching out to me saying that they want to do consultation calls and consultation work. And so I haven't even put an email out. I'm booked at this point for as much as I can do. Anyhow, I just wanted to connect here and give you a personal update and tell you that you are doing amazing work out in the world. It is making a huge difference. You are taking care of yoga. You are taking care of your communities there. You're taking care of yourself. And I'm super proud of you. This is not easy work. Okay, connected yoga teachers, I am closing out. I need to thank our team over here, Suzanne Crunch and Sinead, for all of the work they do to bring this podcast to you and to support the yoga teacher community. And I'd like to thank you, dear listener, for making this podcast possible, for hanging out here right until the end, hearing all of, my personal stuff, as well as today's really amazing interview with Sheena. And I want to leave you with a question. What will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?